Amen. All right. I asked a couple of weeks ago, maybe 3, for suggestions on subjects that we could study or books. I received 1 suggestion, so that's what we're studying. So we're looking at Daniel tonight, and Daniel is an interesting study, and I think that well, I won't say what you're going to get out of it because that's going to depend on you, but nevertheless, I think it's a book that has something to say for us, and I hope you had a chance to read the little sheet that we distributed to you. One of the things that we did was give you some introduction material. It would also benefit you if you had a Bible dictionary or some other book that you could read that would give you some introductory remarks about the book of Daniel. The Israelites were human, and they would go through the cycles, generational cycles. And I think in a way we can see that here in our country as well. There was a time when, particularly in our country, when you weren't around anything or anybody or any kind of civilization, it was basically every man for himself, and people ruled by their own strength and made their laws according to what benefited them. Then as we began to become more populated, cities were formed, and then communities, and they would establish laws. And then there was a period of time when was referred to as the Wild West, and you may or may not realize that there is a city in Kansas called Liberal. You know why? Who was it? Who said that? And you said what? Yeah. Matter of fact, they established Liberal Kansas specifically to be without any influence from God or God's rules. They were going, anything goes. That's what they were, how they were set up. Then there was the 1890s, which was considered to be a pretty wild time in our history. Then things got better. Then there was the Roaring 20s, which really started roaring after they had Prohibition come in. And so we see a cycle coming. So we can't point at Israel and say, shame on you guys for being like that, because as the old expression is, when you point one finger, there's 3 pointing back at you. So here's Israel. This is actually their 3rd captivity. If you look on your map, you have Israel next to the Mediterranean Sea, and then you go over, and there's Assyria. Anyway, I think Babylon is the last kingdom that dominates them. And this domination is allowed because of their wickedness. They will not follow God, and God says, okay, here it comes. I warned you. And so here would come the invading army in. And so God would use them to try to get the Israelites, head on straight. And each of these dominating foreign powers had different opinions about how to deal with their conquered countries. One came in and took people and just scattered them all over everywhere, so that you would end up with such a mixture of people that you'd kind of forget who was who. Then another group would take large chunks and transfer them. We've got to the Babylonian period now, and what he chose to do was pick the brightest and the best. And so Nebuchadnezzar conquers a country. He goes in and says, get me all the smart people. So they group all the smart people and ship them to be with King Nebuchadnezzar so that he can benefit from their talents and abilities. what they were able to do. I don't know where we are exactly. I don't have a process on this, but did anybody figure out or read what does the name Daniel mean? I'm sorry, I got two talking. Susie? Higher up in my notes? And it says what? God is my judge. Anytime you see a name or basically a word that ends in the letters E-L, that means God. So what's the name of the people they're referred to as Israel? I wrote a paper one time and turned it in to my Old Testament professor, and all through that paper, 16, 20 pages, whatever it was, I spelled it wrong. I spelled it Israel, R-E-A-L. No, it's not Israel, it's Israel, God. And God is looking at Daniel. He judges me too, doesn't he? And he's going to judge each and every one of us. But unlike most of our names, again, biblical names typically meant something. So every time his name is spoken, he's reminded, God's going to judge you. God's going to judge you. Or someone says, what is your name? He says, God's going to judge me. Daniel. All right. Okay. We like Daniel typically because of a couple of prophecies that are in there. We'll get to those as we go through. And the fact that they're connected to the New Testament. Other than that, we probably wouldn't care that much about the book, except the fact that, hey, Jesus quoted him, and Paul, they're talking about him as well, talking about the things that he said. All right, anyone else have anything you want to share? Yeah. Yeah. And making the questions up for next week, I took it out, but the first question I wrote down was, have you ever had a dream and then couldn't remember it? I'm not sure Nebuchadnezzar didn't remember the dream. He just wouldn't tell them the dream. However, I am told that you dream every night. And the only way you dream is in your REM, what they call the REM level of sleep. And if you don't dream, then that means you didn't get into the REM level, which means you didn't get a good night's sleep. But I don't remember my dreams. I don't know about you. But for the most part, I don't remember my dreams. Except I do occasionally hear a doorbell, which invariably wakes me up.
I've had that.
Yeah. And one time at our new house, actually it was the doorbell. I went to the door and the policeman was there, and he said, did you mean for the trunk of your car to be up? I said, no, I'll go close it. He said, never mind, I'll do it. So, we were new there, and he'd driven by and seen my trunk had popped open because, you get those keys in your pocket and accidentally press the button. There's no telling what'll happen. But Nebuchadnezzar had this dream. I dropped a paper. Oh, okay. I'd have been looking for that. Thank you. All right.
So these people that say they interpret dreams, not TV, but modern day TV, tell them their dream is, well, this means this. How are we supposed to take it serious or?
Yeah. Modern day dream interpretation, I don't put a lot of stock in. I remember very vividly a couple of dreams that I had, one as a child and one as a young adult. I've mentioned these to you before. The one that I don't know, I guess it was after, I guess I was 23, 24. I was watching a golf tournament in my dream, and standing behind the tee box, the golfer hit the ball, and it went straight up. I mean, for a pro golfer to do something like that, he's got to really miss the shot. And everybody's looking up at that golf ball that just keeps going. It's not slowing down. And suddenly, out from behind clouds, there are these two huge, huge hands that come out. And everybody thinks, well, that's God, we're doomed. And everybody starts running. In my dream, I think, well, if it's God, there's no sense in running, so I just drop down on my knees to pray. And I look up to pray, and about that time, the face comes out behind the cloud, like that. It's Lyndon Johnson. So that was a nightmare, yes. But those who try to interpret dreams, I think, usually miss it. But let me shut up and don't get into that. I think it's interesting that they changed the names of people. What do you think about that? Yeah. We are here on the border. We have a bicultural language situation, and there are some names that we have a problem pronouncing. And if I were to go south of the border and live down there, the likelihood people would call me what? Carlos. Yeah, there'd be some people who'd call me Carlos because that's what they were accustomed to saying. So it may be a little of that. It's just easier to say. Your name's too hard to say. We're going to call you Joe, or something. But nevertheless, Shadrach, Meshach, and the bed we go, and Daniel.
Well, that carried over to in the New Testament. For Matthew, he was Levi, and he was it Greek.
Yeah, and Saul, Paul. So yeah, it happens. So I don't try to read a lot into that, but it's confusing to some people. Why did they change their names? Maybe there's something more to it than I see, but I don't necessarily.
Daniel was more easier to pronounce than Belteshazzar.
Yeah, well, yeah. For us it is anyway. All right. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yeah, it may very well be, and to honor their own local gods, rather than the Hebrew God. I see any number of reasons for it. And sometimes a name or a word is close enough to another word, but yet means something different. I can't think of anything offhand. I used to know a couple.
Spelled the same?
Well, there might be a letter or so different, but
Here and here and here.
yeah, that's in the same language. You're right. But I'm talking about like from one language to another language, and I'll just let me just say something totally stupid. Let's say you go somewhere and you say sauerkraut, and that means one thing to you, but somewhere else it means something else, maybe bad. And so, I can see how that could play a role. I read a story years ago about a man who was working temporarily in Italy, and everybody answered the phone pronto. And in the course of the day, of the week, he's working there. He met a lady and asked her out to dinner. And when he went to her door, knocked on the door, she opened the door, and he said, pronto. And she slapped him and closed the door. Because that meant one thing when you're on the phone, but when you picking up a woman, it doesn't mean hello. It had a different connotation to it. So, yeah, languages are different.
I recently shared with you something my physical therapist had told me about the word adios.
Yeah.
That I told you.
Yeah, but I remember you telling me, but I don't remember you tell the story.
Well, physical therapist was sent to someone's room to do physical therapy for, and he told the lady in his best Spanish what he was going to do, and then she said, okay, adios, and he thought she was saying goodbye, refusing the service, and he went and told his boss. She stopped agreeing to the service, and
little different accent where you move the accent on the syllables, moves it around a little bit. Yeah, so when you go from one culture to another, as these, not just these 4 young men, but many other Israelites, they had adjustments to make. So,
There's a funny story about that, Charles, but kind of grows too. People in northern New Mexico, the word rosca means different than what it does here in El Paso.
Mhm.
A rosca is like a circular sweet bread that they celebrate in January, January 8th, whatever. And if you get, they put a little figurine of baby Jesus in there, and if you get it, that means you host the next party. So you eat you eat the rosca, okay? But in northern New Mexico, a rosca means anus. So when Paul and Gloria were here, the people from here invited them to go eat the rosca. And I go, what?
yeah.
So we're not gonna do that.
Well, like I said, there's adjustments in language and culture. Were you going to?
Yeah, we're doing all the right things, but, so when we start looking at who these individuals are, right, Daniel, who is yep, it means in Babylonian to be protected by the king. So Daniel, it's a title, it's who he is and he is protected by the king. Abednego is each one of these are eunuchs, right? They're eunuchs. They're servants of someone. And then when it talks about Shadrach and Meshach, the ACH is dealing with inspiration of Aku or ACH, which is that portion. The next one is another ACH, and Abednego, which is another, I don't know, inspired by Aku, belonging to Aku, and then a servant of Nego, which is probably a title dealing with the servitude of these individuals as the eunuchs.
Yeah, and as we've said many times before, for us, names don't typically have a second or underlying meaning. They do have originally, but we don't consider them. So here, they didn't name people. They didn't have a baby book of names or a book of, what to name your baby. No, what they named their children were actually real words. And same thing here in this connection here. They're real words that mean something. All right, well, we basically talked about question 1 and 2. Well, let's answer question 2 anyway. What do you got? Question 2. You what?
I didn't look over the question.
Oh, okay. Well, read it right now.
Why did the Lord deliver King Jehoiakim into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar?
Yeah, King, what's his name? We talked about it's how we started off. Cycle, 3 kings, or 3 foreign nations that came in and took them into captivity because they wouldn't follow God. Yeah, they were bad. They were wicked. They were evil. They were sinners. And when you go to the prophets, all of the prophets are telling Israel, get back on track. Repent and get back and follow God. That's the whole story is all the prophets are trying to get Israelites to straighten up and fly right. And eventually when they will not, in comes, God allows a foreign power to come in. See, in the beginning, he protects them. In the beginning, he helps them in their battles and in their victories.
And then for a period of time, they do what they're supposed to
there's the cycle, you know. There's the good people, and then the people who wander off, and then the people who are just downright bad. And then hopefully out of that bad low in their life and culture, there will be some who will come to repentance. They'll turn back to God and call on to God for deliverance, and He delivers them again. And we got a generation of good people following God, and then the cycle repeats itself.
Because they'd already, I also have to think too, right, because they'd already lost the northern kingdoms. Everything had already set up. This was the king of Judah, and that was basically that portion. It says reigning from 608 to 598. The third year was 605 according to chronological system used by Daniel, in which only the whole year is counted. It goes on, Jehoiakim looked towards Egypt in the time, and then ended up basically being caught.
Yeah.
Better if I just pull you in and don't make you a problem anymore.
Right. And, you know, typically, it seems like they did this repeatedly. Instead of turning to God, they turned to Egypt. Okay, and God's basically standing there with his hands out saying, call on me and I'll save you. And they're saying, well, you know, Egypt's got 100,000 soldiers. They'll help us. And that never works. So repeatedly, they're let down by their sinful nature, conduct, what they're doing, and also typically by Egypt as well. All right, verse 3, who's taken into captivity? Verse 3 and following. Already conquered the nation. Now, who does Nebuchadnezzar want serving in his administration? The cream of the crop. The best and the brightest. Yeah. And do they have an election? No, they just go in and take them. You don't have a choice. They don't ask you, would you like to go to Babylon? No. Now, I wouldn't even call it a draft. It's worse than that. You know, they're captured, they're hauled off. And they are, for the most part, taken away from their families. So you're there by yourself. There'll be some other Jews there that you may or may not know. But likelihood is your family's back in Israel. All right, verse 5. What did Nebuchadnezzar want to accomplish? Yeah. And depending on the situation, captives were frequently, from our point of view, treated very poorly. The men might very well be castrated, made into eunuchs. It's also possible that they may have had their thumbs cut off. It was a common practice, especially if you captured a king. You know, if he didn't commit suicide and you got him before he did that, then those are the things you would do to him, and you'd cut off his big toe. Without a thumb, you couldn't hold on to a weapon to stab the king, not very well at least. You couldn't fight very well. And without a big toe, you can't run. You're hobbled. So, hey, you know, it'd be like, you know, you just imagine what that would be like to have your dining room with all of your many, many guests, because you're the king, you can afford to feed everybody. You've got all your many guests coming in from your kingdom and maybe some foreign dignitaries as well. And all the people who are serving you are former celebrities or high echelon government officials from countries you've conquered. Like, oh, here, it's a guy in Russia, Putin. Putin, bring me some more bread. So here's Putin, who used to dominate Russia. He's now coming over here, you know, with a tray that's got fresh bread on it. And, yeah, and like if you'd conquered China, you know, you would have that guy, and the whole purpose being to flaunt what you have done. And also the entertainment. But that has been a practice for many centuries in, I don't know what to say, kingdoms. For instance, every once in a while I hear people they badmouth the Crusades and talk about how bad it was for Europe to launch all those crusades against the armies of it in the cities of Islam. But do you know why they did that? Say again?
They were killing pilgrims. People were trying to, a lot of them.
The Islamics were. Yeah, the Islamics were doing more than that. They were conquering territories. They took over and ruled Spain for like 600 years. And it wasn't until finally, after 20 campaigns against Europe, Europe finally said 5 campaigns against Islam because Europe was not united. So they finally resisted and were victorious in the process. But what I was going to get to is in that first course, when the imam who was leading the army first conquered Spain, first thing he did, or one of the first things he did, was order 1,000 blonde virgins to be captured from Spain and brought to him in Africa. Now, you ever seen a movie where you have the harem dancers, and they all look so happy? They were happy. They were slaves, been captured and yanked away from their homes. I'm not trying to, at this point, trying to pick on either side, but I want us to just recognize this was the ancient world. And these men who had been captured from Israel and hauled off to Babylon, they weren't happy about being there. It wasn't where they wanted to be. But they did the best they could, made the best of the situation.
What does that say to the common people? If I can do that to them, guess what I can do to you?
Right. Now, another thing about taking the best and the brightest is they basically left home without leaders. So if you conquer a country and you go in and you take off the top of intelligence and leadership, then what do you have left? Basically followers who don't have any knowledge of how to lead or how to fight or how to figure things out. They're just farmers or something like that. And so they can't build up and resist you. Next time you go, or you don't expect them to have an army trying to overthrow you. All right, to comment on Daniel's decision in verse 8.
Don't have food given to the gods, defile himself because of that reason.
Yeah. So, tell me something about Daniel and these other 4 men and the foods. What are we talking about here?
One commentary says they avoided the rich diet as a way of protecting themselves from being tempted by Babylonian culture. Their restricted diet continually reminded them that they were before God alone.
Okay. I don't know about the rich diet part of it, but okay. What's the issue with Jewish diet? Kosher. And what does kosher mean? First of all, it was a certain kind of food. And then second of all, it was prepared a certain kind of way. Tell me about seafood. Well, they could eat seafood, but what did it have to have? Scales. Catfish is out. And if you're from over in the south, the southeast, catfish is like top of the menu. You drive down the highway and you see catfish restaurant, because that's what they serve. So you couldn't eat catfish, you couldn't eat eel, you couldn't eat shrimp. There are a lot of things that we today might eat that they were told not to eat. All right? That was seafood. Let's talk about other food. What other foods could they not eat? Pork. Couldn't eat pork. Say again? Couldn't eat lizards. Now, again, sometimes I wonder why. I think that quite possibly some of the restrictions that God put on the Israelites had to do with their health. You know, the pig is very similar to a human anatomy, and as a consequence, if it's not properly prepared, well cooked, you can get worms from pigs and some other things. I had a lady tell me one time on another subject that during World War II, her brother had his stomach blown apart, and they replaced it with a stomach from a pig, and it worked. So I don't know. I'm not trying to read God's mind per se, but I'm just trying to figure out what's wrong with pig, because I grew up eating pork chops and sausage, you know, so I didn't understand that. But it has to be prepared properly. And so Daniel says what? No, I'm not going to eat this stuff, because it's a direct violation. It's not just a matter of my personal preference. Some people just don't like certain foods, but it's not it. That's not what we're talking about here. Daniel says, I'm dedicating myself to God. I am a slave, a captive in a foreign land. I have been brought into the king's administration. I may not be in the quote-unquote castle, but I'm in his royal entourage, and I'm being treated very nice, but I'm not going to eat that stuff.
It seems like they're having parties.
Yeah.
3 years worth of delicacies, wine, which they drank, 3 years of training for them. So they got like all this stuff going on, served before the king. So Daniel's basically going, please, if you, I would rather not eat if this is.
Yeah, and the wine I can only assume means drunkenness. You know, but I don't know of any prohibition against wine or a particular kind of wine. You know, you can't drink red wine, you can only drink white wine, or vice versa. But I would assume it had to do with drunkenness and other fitting in with the culture. Everything's debauchery, and probably a lot of other things that, you know, we wouldn't want to do either. But again, the issue, the point that we're trying to point out here is, here is I'll call him a kid. He may very well be a teenager at this point, but here's a kid who says, I'm not doing that because my God doesn't want me to. And, you know, that's a tough thing to decide. It could very easily have been a death sentence or a horrible beating or being kicked out of his privileged position. Any number of things. But he says, I don't care. I'm not going to disgrace my God.
Throughout at least the first 8 chapters of the book, it shows how much Daniel had confidence and trust in
Yes, repeatedly. Yeah, Daniel really trusted in God. All right, anyone else? All right, question 6. Explain Daniel's reason for eating only vegetables. How could they have been healthier? We kind of touched on that, but let's get into it a little bit more.
This is probably the basis for why people go vegetarian. This thing, and they agreed to this. Yeah, they came out looking healthier and better than everybody else and ate the rest of the stuff.
Yeah.
So, let's eat vegetables. You need protein. Running is protein.
Yeah. You know, you know, obviously I can't read anybody's mind in this, you know, the thinking of the Babylonians, what their thought process it is. Were they trying to feed them a lot of oily foods, and people were popping out with pimples, and that's what happened. But Daniel and his group said no, and so they didn't have any pimples, so they looked better. I don't know. But I would say that they ate vegetables and came out healthier because of God. You know, whether it was their diet per se, or whether or not it was God intervening with Daniel and keeping them, you know, healthy and in a good report. So again, the trust and the faith that Daniel and his comrades are demonstrating here that's a big part of the lesson of the whole book. of the trust that Daniel had in God. Anyone else care to share anything?
Well, Charles, God said that he declared all food is clean, so I don't understand why he just didn't want to eat the meat.
Well,
Only
this time they were under the law.
Say what?
This time they were under the law, so that they made everything clean later.
Yeah, but you were going to say, finishing that, Gene?
That was like, that's the statute.
Yeah. Yeah. At this time, they're under the Mosaical law, Mosaical diet restrictions, and all of that. And like I said, we can try to read God's mind and figure out why, but we don't really know. But I suspicion that God had some reasons for it. And one of the things that I always point out or use as an illustration is that when Israel got out of Egypt, God tells them how to go to the bathroom. Go out and dig a hole, do your stuff, and then cover it back up. I mean, you talk about elementary. Maybe that's how stupid they were. Anyway, I think God had his reasons for a lot of things that we think are just being arbitrary. He's just trying to make things hard. Like a group of boys who form a club and have a password and say, you got to do this. Why? Well, we just got to. They don't have a reason for it. They just make up something stupid or weird. And in order to be in the club, you got to, do that particular thing. I don't think God's doing that. I don't think he's playing stupid games. But
He could have been testing their faith in him.
there can be the question of faith, of obeying God. All right, draw your conclusion as to why God would give these four men special abilities.
So the reason why that, so Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, all of them, they have not, they've heard of the God of Israel, but at this point they had not directly seen the demonstration because obviously, Israel is not with God. But the same reason he gave those abilities to the apostles to use and to validate, hey, this, what I'm telling you is true. He was giving those individuals stuff with him to validate what they were saying about our God is the true God. This is for real.
Yeah.
These are the miraculous things we're going to do.
And Israel and the surrounding nations probably knew all, if not many, of the stories about how God gave Israel that land and how they were victorious. But that's been 400 years ago. Yeah, what's God done for you lately? Nothing. Because you're my slave. And before me, you were the slave of, the Assyrians. Before me, the slave of someone else. So, they thought of gods in this time in history. They thought of gods as being geographical and conquerable. If my God's bigger than your God, I'm going to come into your land and I'm going to not only stomp on you, I'm going to stomp on your God. And now tell me some of the stories about your God. What was his name? Yahweh? Yeah. What are those myths? What are those lies that you tell about how Israel was created by your God, Yahweh? Oh, those are funny. Yeah, I can just laugh at that. Those are such silly things. Walking across a dry bed of the Red Sea, the Reed Sea. That just, yeah. Okay, again, the mindset of the time, the thought process of the time. So,
I mean, we do it, not we. It happens now.
yeah. Well, for one thing, as they say, the winner writes the history book. And Israel has not been a winner in a long time. They haven't won anything. They've lost everything. So now, God has given them some special abilities. The question is, can you think of any reason as to why?
Their faith was really strong.
may have been men of great faith. And so he knew that these are guys that can do my will. Good. Anything else?
They're already setting themselves apart. Like we're gonna not do what everybody else is doing.
You've got skills and talents and faith. I'm just going to manufacture them or multiply them, make you stronger, give you opportunities for your faith to grow. For what purpose do you think God would want to bless them?
Because he knew probably they were going to be tested.
Yeah. And they can be his instruments. They can be his proclaimers. Because eventually they're going to go back to Israel. And they want people who go back to Israel to be people of faith, people of courage, people who've committed to serving God. So here are potential leaders in this faith-based effort. Not going to happen overnight. It has to grow. And part of our issue, I think, of human beings is we want it to happen right now. I mean, what would you like to happen in this country right now? Well, it's not going to happen like that, is it? We didn't get this way at the snap of a finger. It was a gradual decline. And in order for us to get and to make this country what we want it to be, we're going to have to work on it, and it's likely going to be a gradual climb up the hill. So God sees them as the potential future of Israel. Anyone else? Trusting the process. All right, good. Like that. All right. Well, we kind of touched on question 8 just then about the end result of these events. When God blesses these 4 men, what happened? They were elevated. They rose in the ranks, and we're going to see it happen again in the next chapter. So it lifted up. You know, it's like Joseph in Egypt. He didn't walk into Egypt and take over as second in command, did he? No. Right. He spent a lot of time in jail. He first was in Potiphar's house, and then when he was taken out of jail, you know, he was basically running the jail. I mean, he was, you know, he did well, and he rose in rank. Now, is there a lesson there for us? Yeah, I think whoever we are, wherever we are, we need to do our best, and we need to be rising in the ranks. You know, whether it's at work or wherever it might be, in a civic club, we need to be living our lives so godlike that people begin to trust in us. Yes?
I appreciated part of your article in this week's book that talked about the 7 deadly sins. Anyway, you mentioned slothfulness and how Christians should not be known as slothful, lazy people. Even in our jobs, we should be the ones to rise up and do the desk job work. I think that's God's will for us.
Yeah.
And we should be known within the ranks as that person who gets.
And another thing I touched on there was all the things that are listed there are basically extremes of what is natural. Like, you got to eat, but he says don't be a glutton. You know, so we take things and we drive them to an extreme, and we ought to be the Christians ought to be the kind of people that everybody else looks to and says, I want to be like that. I want to be like that. A role model. Thank you. Yes, and sometimes we'll fail it. Unfortunately, when we fail, sometimes we quit and give up. We give up and quit, whichever comes first.
It's extremely difficult in this time of our society. I've mentioned several times that I was downgraded on reviews because I did not participate in their happy hours. Everybody's looking for one happy hour. What did that have to do with my job? Why was I degraded on my review, my yearly review, as I was not a team player.
Yeah.
Because I did not go.
And remember that because we get a little further into the book, and that's going to be a part of the equation.
And I tried to explain to the clinic administrator, I don't drink, I don't smoke, I don't curse. I have no place
Right, after you clocked out, not being paid. Yeah. So when you're in an environment that is, for lack of a better phrase, ungodly, and they get their concept of value from ungodly conduct, makes it difficult for the Christian to fit into that. So here's Daniel. He's godly. Everybody around him is ungodly. What they're doing is ungodly. And yet his faith and his courage keeps him from participating in their ungodly conduct. And it's just an example of the struggle, of the faith and the struggle that he faced and he and his friends faced, which hopefully would be a lesson for us, a role model for us, that we could then be a role model for other people. Good. Anyone else? Well, from my perspective, I would say that at this time in history, God is active in their lives, and God played a role in blessing them and helping them to do better. I'm not a believer in modern day miracles, but I do believe that God can operate and does operate through what we call providence, which basically is an unseen action of God. He does something, and I don't know how he did it. I think that happens. That's why we pray. We pray for people to get well. I don't expect them to jump out of the bed and say, hey, I'm cured of my disease. But if once in a while the doctor say, wow, I don't know how that happened, but you're better. Yeah, that's what they said about me. But yeah, but I mean, I do believe that God worked with Daniel, whether it's providence or outright miracle in these occasions. He's helping them in their position, in their role, so that they're going to be able to do something even greater and better in a few more years. Because this book actually covers several years. All right, anyone else?
Was Daniel in exile for 70 years?
Yeah, I don't think he ever goes back. He dies there, but how long he was there? Yeah. I think it was 70 years, but I'm not positive. All of that is calculated by people because, they didn't keep time like we do. They didn't have a big calendar. I was born in the third term of Franklin Roosevelt. What does that tell you? Not much. Yeah, I've been here a long time, but it's not very specific, is it? And then somebody else says, well, I was born in the term of Harry Truman. Okay, well, see, in order to know what that means, you got to know when those guys were there. So the people who don't have anything else to do than count all this stuff back, they're the ones that come up with the dates. And so we talk about AD 33 and BC 33, because it means we have a point. AD stands for Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, and BC is before Christ. And we measure everything that way, back and forth. Now they're trying to change that. Currently they refer to AD as CE, which means what? Common era. And they want to say common era because they don't want to say Christ or year of our Lord. They don't want to say AD. So that's the unbelievers. So going back to other topics that we were discussing earlier. But I think you're right about the 70 years.
Well, the commentary mentions that Daniel was deported to Babylon in 605 BC, again, like you said, that's arbitrary number. And then verse 21 says, and Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. I don't know Cyrus.
Right. Well, let those guys do that counting. I'm not worried about it. But the BC and the AD, those are numbers that are based on the birth of Christ, which are not totally accurate for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is there's no zero. Yeah. So, and another thing is that the guy named Usher who came up with the counting, he missed it about 4 years. So in reality, Jesus was born like in 4 BC. He was born 4 years before himself. So anyhow, that messes our calendars up and all that kind of stuff. But we're not worried about that so much now. But go ahead and read chapter 2. I think we've got some question sheets back there if you didn't get a question sheet for chapter 2. I think chapter 2 is a little more interesting than chapter 1, though I think chapter 1 was interesting. I hope that you'll read the chapter, look over the questions, and do a little thinking about them.